hopefully you all have met everyone at the bar or met each other this morning, but just in case, we're going to kind of go around and do some introductions. Davy Demeyer, founder of Helsel. You've spent 10 years in China and 20 years at Actimium. Did you want to introduce yourself, maybe say something?
Yeah, so hello everybody. So I'm originally an automation engineer. I worked 20 years for Actimium, which is one of the biggest system integrators in the world, although not many people know it in the US. So I started in Belgium. I did some projects abroad, UK, Germany, and then I went off to China to do projects. Then I moved permanently in 2012. And I led the software and automation team there for the last more than 10 years. I've always been focusing on process industry, so pharma, food, chemicals, really the process side. And I actually just left the company to start my own startup, a bit out of frustration of how the automation world is a bit stuck. I didn't really see it changing in the past 20 years, but we see the software world changing. So we can discuss this more about this later. And I just moved back to Belgium for this. And this is also the first time I'm in the US. So thanks for inviting me, David. Yeah.
All right, next up, Andy Robinson. You're the founder of GXPass. Would you mind grabbing that mic and introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Andy. I guess, working backwards. Right now, I'm technically the founder, CEO, janitor, accounting department, finance department, security department for GXPass. It's a software startup trying to help improve how we do formal testing in the pharmaceutical environment. Kind of working back from that, for the last 6 years, I also work with a equipment manufacturer in the biotech space, trying to do as many innovative things as we can within the pretty small box that is traditional automation. And then before that, a lot of integration work. But I've kind of worked on the asset owner side, on the integrator side, and the OEM side, so I get a perspective of all the different the perspectives of, why when these people want these people to do this, well, no, you don't do that, and they have a good reason. And I would just like to register that I'm far and away the dumbest person on this panel. So I just trust me when I say that.
Next we have Mike Helsel, TPM, Principal TPM at Microsoft.
I have to do the obligatory, sorry guys, my voice is, we're working to try and keep it. So unlike these guys who are founders of their own thing, any views or opinions that I express are not the opinions of Microsoft. But what I bring to the space, I'm thrilled to be sitting up here with these guys. I got my start in automation when I sailed through the deliverables due in a mechanical engineering internship in an automotive tool supplier, in 2007. And it was like, cool, so what am I going to do for the next 10 months? Right? And they're like, have you heard about controls? And I was like, no. And they were like, Google it. And, this roll mill, which is, I don't know, anyone here know what a roll mill is? Okay, cool. Yeah, but it's a large, say, football field length machine that, traditionally bends steel, welds it, chops it. So I got my start in industry in 2007. Since then, have worked some names that you might recognize, including I've worked on projects for Tesla, worked at Amazon, worked at Microsoft, worked at Google. I care a lot about the automation space and making the work that happens in that space suck less. What has brought me here to learn with you guys together and discuss some of these ideas is the incredible energy that I noticed from these guys, from Jeff, David, and all the incredible hosts here at Loop.
David, I feel like we're in your space, and you've been kind of the face of this
home
movement
field
for a while.
advantage.
But would you mind giving maybe a little introduction for those who aren't as familiar with you?
Sure. And I was talking to Mike last night, and I was like, oh, yeah, so I started the company 17 years ago. And he's like, 17, like that was a long ass time ago. So I'm a co-founder of Loop. We started in 2007, and as I've been reflecting on that, I've been thinking I was radicalized really early. Like I've never written ladder in my life. Like I was lucky to have stumbled into B&R controls back then and recognized it as, oh, this is a real software IDE. And I knew what that was when I was 23. And so I was like, this is awesome. I want to get involved in that. And I didn't care that no one had heard of it or used it because I was just instantly so passionate about what was possible with the technology. And that obviously building cool things and amazing things, as you maybe see all around you, is what I'm passionate about doing. And so what are the techniques to do that? Excited about technology. Like that's kind of the theme of our company and what I've been excited to do ever since. And it's been a long journey. Like we started off like really focused on B&R distribution, and we still do that. We're still like tight B&R partner. But over the years, we sort of brought more of a broader integration focus into our company and kind of experimented with a lot of different businesses and technologies. And, you know, we've done a lot of labsy stuff. So really excited for all the kind of creativity that we could bring to a very challenging and, let's say, conservative industry.
That's a great place to start. I think between conversations last night and just my general knowledge of working with you all, you know, you hear a lot of this refrain of like slow-moving industry, or it can be sometimes a little stubborn, not really interested in going in the next direction. And then we've talked a lot about how, in terms of automation software engineering, this has been a discipline that some of you have been doing for a long time. But it hasn't really taken off. And then a little while ago, you posted a graphic online, and now we're here. I guess my question to start off for this group is, why now? What's going on now that's making SASE, you know, jump in popularity and making more people turn their eyeballs in this space?
You started it.
I started it. Well, I was speculating or having some conversations about it last night, and as much as I'd like to say it was the perfection of the JPEG that I posted, I think I have two feelings. One is like, when is this ever going to happen? And also it has kind of an inevitability feeling to me. So the inevitability part gives me a lot of patience to like keep at it, because it's like, it's going to happen at some point. I think that was the case even then, because it's like, or at least I'll just do this. You know, I don't care if other people do. Like, whoever wants to work with me, that's how big the company will be. But I guess to your question, I think there's also something like, honestly, maybe simple and almost like a demographic question. Like, I was in a conversation and I said, you know, what year were you born? And I was born in 82, so I'm 42. And I was lucky and fortunate or whatever to have kind of been into a position where like I was in a place where I could control the environment and choose the technology when I was in my 20s. And so now we've been doing that for 20 years, but it's like there aren't that many 40-year-olds that are in charge of automation companies at any scale. But interestingly, some of them that have done a lot of new and interesting things that we would know or recognize, like kind of like the SpaceXs of the world, they were run by 30-year-olds when they made those decisions about how they were going to do things. And so I think there's something around like, if you know, did you grow up with video games in your house and are you comfortable with that stuff? Like I think that might be why that is starting to happen now, where people in their 40s are like in a position of power or influence enough to say like, we're going to do this way, which is something that they're personally comfortable with and can see the benefit of. So I don't know if it's that simple, but like that's a big factor. You know, it's just sort of like, how are who's in charge? What's their background? You know, what do they come up doing? You know, most of the companies in automation are rightfully like very mechanically minded and have been for 100 or 200 years. So this is something that's like, I think that's a big reason about the timing. Personally, you guys want to add to that?
I know Andy about 10 years.
2017 is when we had our first talk.
So he wrote. So I found him online. So he was one of the first people who started writing about this kind of ideas online. And I think at that time, some people reached out to you, but not too many. If you go back 10 years ago, almost nobody would say, yeah, there's something. But today, what I see, it's still small, but some people are starting to say, okay, it's not normal the way that we deliver automation projects. So it's on the one hand, of course, it has always been individual engineers. You always had people that said, yeah, we need to do more open source, and we need to, I don't know, do some Python or whatever. But now something is starting to shift, a bit like you say. people who have a bit more power, people who look a bit at the bigger picture. Some people in the bigger companies, some people in quite big companies, that are also getting frustrated and are saying, this cannot be, we need to find a better way. But it's very difficult today because there's not really an offer on the market. If you go to the big vendors, you can almost not find anything. But things are changing. So I think I can name, for example, Siemens, which is at the same time a very conservative company, but they, for example, build a new team with Semantic AX, which is totally throwing around how we look at the automation system. They take Visual Studio Code, they add some plugins on it, they do everything code first, so all the code-in files, all the configuration in JSON files. So if a company like this is investing so much, it means something is happening. But it's still going to be difficult. So you also need to look at the market. So some of the discussions I had also yesterday. So you need to look, and this is also what Siemens is a bit struggling with now. How do you bring this to the market? How do you get it implemented? So I feel we're a bit now in a situation where companies are starting, but it's like everybody is looking at each other. You also see this like with, so in the process world, now there's, so in the process world, we're really having bigger problems than in the discrete industry. In the discrete industry, you can go to systems that are much more open. We are stuck in the DCS systems. And so some big companies, led by ExxonMobil, which is one of the biggest process companies, they said we need to open up these systems. So it's open up the DCS systems. They are now making a new standard called Open Process Automation. They're specifying the controllers of the future, which in the end will probably end up in discrete industry because they're becoming so open, standardized, you can run containers on it. But again, there, it's everybody's looking at each other. Who's now going to be the first who's going to implement this kind of open system? And I think we're somewhere in the next years come at a tipping point where some of these big companies are going to implement this kind of system. And then it will be very difficult for other end users to not look at it anymore. If a big pharma company suddenly says, I use an open system, and my validation becomes more easy. I can go faster from my design to the operations and with more confidence, then it will be a tipping point. But I feel now we're just before this. So yeah, that's what I see.
You actually reminded me of the LinkedIn article that I wrote. It was in 2015. And I remember the title of it was, "We Need More Composers and Less Luthiers." And the concept behind it was, then and now, everyone in the industry spends way too much time on the small details. Like there's not enough collaboration across stuff. We were talking, earlier today about like a PID loop. The fact that we all build way too much stuff from scratch. Even in an individual company, we're still building way too much stuff from scratch. And what I was comparing and contrasting with is I was looking at, because it was the time when I was starting to learn about open source and, companies like Microsoft who, they hadn't then, but now they've contributed, say, TypeScript, or Facebook has contributed React. Can you imagine the state of web development if everyone had to build their own primitives in front end? It would be horrific. And so it was taking an inspiration from that. And so that I think was the seeds for me is like, as an industry, we could go so much faster if it was much more collaborative. But right now, the issue is where all of our code lands is it doesn't lend itself to that. And the question of like, why now? I think all of us have always been out there, but there was no central location for everyone to coalesce. And I think it just so happened that, SASE is a place where a bunch of us are starting to coalesce and maybe put together, thoughts and ideas as a collective instead of individuals. Because there's a bunch of open source automation projects out there. There's a ton of them, like Open PLC and this, that, and whatever, although there's a big squabble going on with that right now with the Burmese guys and whatever. And my gosh, there's probably, 15 or 20, hey, I've created a cool HTML5 HMI. Give it a try. And then I look at the repo, and it hasn't been touched in 6 years. And it was 2 people. And so to me, the only thing that's going to move this forward is actually a larger community and collective.
We probably have a lot of cool things to talk about, so I'll keep this very, very short. I think the concept of DevOps, like the process of and the discipline of DevOps, is what was a game changer for me, right? Like people carrying around alarms on their phones where, a web page loads 25% slower than it should, and they have their laptops out and are actively working on that. I was like, shit. Like I'm working with real stuff that is like value added, and I spend no time maintaining existing fleets. I just assume that the next version will solve all the problems until a customer that is like a maven, passionate about the machine, sends me a detailed list of everything that's wrong and why I suck because of it, right? And like seeing that it didn't have to be that way, that I could learn from software teams, and that I could participate in creating environments where junior engineers could like thrive their whole way into senior engineers. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so different than my experience. I really want to understand what's going on here and where we can borrow from that. Because solutions aren't inherently more valuable if they're composable and redeployable, right? A solution that doesn't ever need an update, people are right when they say that that's just as good. However, the discipline of DevOps really kind of like welcomed me into, there's a whole lot of stuff that I thought was fully baked that might not be.
Davey, you mentioned Siemens. We've talked a little bit about a few other organizations, and I guess I'm curious about, now that we're seeing, I like how you kind of mentioned we're at the tip of the threshold. We're still on this side of it, but we can kind of see it coming. Things are coalescing, things are coming together. I'm curious where we have seen this breaking through. If you have any sort of insight into projects you've worked on or things you've been involved in recently where you're starting to see more and more adoption of these technologies.
I have seen, for example, something more at the MES level. So the MES level is what I see the level between automation and the ERP system. Again, I'm talking about process automation. It's one very big company. They have 200 plants all over the world. And they first started with the classical MES approach. So they used an off-the-shelf system, which is never off the shelf. And they did quite a lot of plans. And they were quite successful in rolling them out. But then they got stuck. They got stuck on licensing fees, so 200 plants, imagine. It adds up. They got stuck on upgrades because they had a system that was specifically made for the MES market, for industry. But they were it's only one system because all the big vendors have an MES system, and many vendors have multiple MES systems. So they got stuck on the upgrades. They were unable to do source control, so everything was inside, this code was inside databases. The whole rollout grinded to a halt. And at a certain moment, somehow they started working with a small system integrator, not the system integrator I worked for. And they somehow ended up with .NET and HTML5 architecture. I think it was React or something like this. They built the MES again, so the functionality they needed, with this open software. It's not open source. I mean, they were based on open source, but it was their own. It belonged to them. And then they started rolling out again. And then suddenly everything went much faster because they had no limitations. And they could roll out as fast as they could. And so this is an example where you already can see that if you can base yourself on open systems, it doesn't always have to be open source. If you can take more control as an end user, you can go much faster. So that's one example what I have seen.
I mean, I've seen lots of custom solutions, but I think the thing that I have not seen, and I got this was not your question, but I guess it makes me think about it. The thing that I have not seen, and that what I hope we see and figure out how to make happen is a true, open platform that gets adopted by more than one company. Because it's easy to find lots of spot solutions, but the difference is, and even before the time of open source and general software, there was tons of custom code that was written and that worked great, as opposed to off-the-shelf code, but it wasn't shared by the community and collaborated on by the community. And so that's the thing is I don't know of any good examples today, unfortunately.
I think the coolest example that I've seen of a project done really well was at Amazon working on their outbound labeling machines. Seeing those projects go from thousands of different individual versions to just one version with thousands of instances, where you could see things come in like, who is the last author that made a change to this system, right? And then I would be on call and be able to ask somebody, hey, what change did you make? I didn't change it, Well, I see here a message that says that you changed it 15 minutes before I got this alarm. What did you change?
I have the proof.
And like maybe it was inadvertent, but so much of controls engineering support for systems for my career has been blind, where you just assume between the two times that you connect to the system that nobody else connected to it, that it's in the state that it was in, right? That, the logs are fine, the system is fine, right? Oh, no smoke is coming out, so it's exactly as healthy as the last time I connected to it. I think to Davy's point earlier, systems don't have to be fully open source to make use of this benefit, right? There can be proprietary pieces, there can be proprietary pipelines, but really just bringing observability into a level where there's a shared understanding of facts, right? Okay, well, you did change something 15 minutes ago. If that was an accident, we can talk through that, right? But this event happened, and then we're on this, Sev 2. Let's talk about what changed. Are you noticing a difference? Right? Being able to bring tightly coupled attribution to diagnosing a real problem in the field is just a game changer. Because, then you're not dealing with these abstract feelings of oh, you guys make bad machines, or oh, this code is bad. It's be clinical, describe the symptoms you are experiencing. I can help you, but I need to know what's happening. Not just if you dislike that machine, we both dislike it right now because we're both awake at 3 a.m.,
As much as I think we could see here's what a platform would look like, or here's kind of if SASE were to make a platform, here's what it would be, right? Maybe somebody will do that this afternoon and make a list. But in this crowd, we're talking about where we want to take it next, but if you also just go back and look at some of the basics, like source control, most stuff that's out there on the floors is not source controlled at all, which is if you were to tell software engineers that, they would be horrified, literally horrified. And so it's hard to speak to we can speak to wins, or stuff that we're super proud of, or where it's this has given us confidence. This definitely works. Like, we have one of our biggest projects ever that we've been on this like multi-year R&D pursuit with a large aerospace company. Someone posted in Slack the other day, how are we going to celebrate the 2000th pull request on this project? And just as like a little nutshell of like what the success of a different type of technique looks like, that the scale of that and like just imagining what's gone into that is incredible, because every pull request has had like 2-3 people like going back and forth, checking in comments, doing reviews, checking it back in. The entire history is there. Like, there have been 2,000 changes to that software in 2,000 pull requests, right? 2,000 issues solved in that way. And it's just like, it does work at that scale. Like, and if you think about trying to do that a different way, it's like, it's basically impossible. So it's like, it's really working. And that there's places where, yeah, we've been doing that for a long time. It works. That's why we have the confidence to go to other places and be like, no, we're sure that this is how this ought to be done. Like, it's not really, to us or to this crew or people in this room, it's not debatable, really.
You've all mentioned open source. Let's talk about that a little bit. I think that stands out to me because, was it the 90s? In the software boom, open source was like a critical component to really pushing all the abilities of technology forward. It was all over the place. But it's hard to ignore the idea that, or the reality that this industry, automation in general, is a pretty tightly held IP industry, right? Everybody's creating their own systems and creating their own things. What is the role of open source as we're moving forward? Like, how do you all see that affecting the industry, affecting how we're doing things?
I guess the contrast to the general software space is the idea of velocity. And actually in 2016, I gave a talk at and by the way, I'll plug, there's a conference in Raleigh at the end of October called All Things Open. It's a huge conference, not relative to other stuff, but I think there'll probably be 3,000 or 4,000 people there. It's a really good conference. And I gave a talk there saying, hey, all you open source people, not even necessarily with your tools and technologies, but your community concepts, if y'all want to really make an impact, come over to manufacturing. Because let me show you the GDP, the contribution to GDP from manufacturing versus software. It's a big difference. It's a big difference. I mean, I'm happy that you're making a better app, but we'd be a lot better off being able to start up a pharmaceutical plant faster or start up a chip plant faster or whatever. And so for me, the idea of open source is about it's the whole rising tide lifts all boats. But like you said, the problem in our industry, as you see it, within pockets of collaborative people, we're fine. But as you go from integrator to integrator or manufacturing company to manufacturing company, say end user, everyone thinks they're a damn snowflake. But if you've been an integrator and you've been in all these plants, you're like, hey, guess what? Y'all are all the same. You all have the same problem. And when I got more experience as an integrator, I'd walk into a plant, we'd be there for an hour or two, and then I would start asking these leading and probing questions. The kind of question you ask where the way you ask it, you're basically telling them I already know the answer. And they're like, how did you know that? I was like, y'all are all the same. And so I think, that's one leg of what the challenge is going to be, is not only do we have issues with tooling, don't have open formats, but that's the next part of it, is the cultural part. Are people willing to share? Is like, I worked so hard and I put in all these hours building this library. Why should I give it away? And then be willing to use other people's stuff, because when I wrote it, I know it's good. When you wrote it, I don't know about it. And by the way, here's a little nod to this guy over here, who, when did open source really, really, really hit a tipping point? And I'm going to speculate here. I bet it was when the big giants started offering, like, open sourcing their work. Mm-hmm. And that all of a sudden made it acceptable for everyone. So if a library came out of Microsoft or Google, chances are it's really, really good. And so I don't know, that may be one part of it, but yeah.
I think we're still waiting to see that domino drop. And in our crystal ball of looking back what was happening with software 30 years ago to predict what's about to happen over here in automation, I was talking about it needs to make sense for businesses. Like, and these businesses didn't do that because like they were benevolent, right? These are like the biggest, most brutal companies in the world, bloodthirsty, et cetera. They're not doing it like out of some sense of altruism. They're like, this will help us kick more ass and like destroy our competition. Like there's still that energy behind it. And like there's stories of companies where they switched over from like, and it's not easy, right? Like companies that like, I think I was talking about Amazon back 20 years ago, like switching away from Oracle. It's like they were using, proprietary stack, just like the Allen Bradley of transactional databases. And they're like, one day they're like, we're going to go to Linux, which was very audacious for them to do that, right? And now you look at what they've done, like, and then what that meant about the community. Like, there's an opportunity that piece can get commoditized by open source. That's what happens, because like it's more important to Amazon that they're like taking over e-commerce. They don't care about this. So it's like I think like you're not. But what it also means is like Oracle didn't do open source. Some guy in Finland did open source, right? So it's like I think it's just like we haven't seen that, but it's like real businesses that are going to be making that choice, kind of like initially like in a very audacious way, because like they're just gonna have to like leap on there, then everybody's gonna get behind it. Like I think that's like what we're waiting to see, but like it's kind of waiting to happen. I don't think you're gonna see it even from the really innovative platforms, the ones that we would use today in controls. I don't think that we can expect that from them, because it doesn't make sense for their business. It's gonna be somebody else or something else that's out there, and maybe it'll be another Amazon who's like, yeah, we decided we're going to do controls on Linux too, and like maybe that'll happen. That would be a game changer if that started to happen. If we started to see that, or if it started to become public, or they start, like it's waiting to happen. And a lot of those companies are the proprietary ones. They're just sort of putting their fingers in there and trying to hope that it doesn't happen, or they're trying to squash it, but they can't. They're not going to be able to keep the genie in the bottle, in my opinion. It's just going to happen sooner or later.
I mean, even in that, as you said, looking at the crystal ball, there's some like elements that seem pretty different. Like the internet wasn't a 50-year-old industry, it's a 100-year-old industry of big machines that have been literally drilled into the ground. It was, a digital space. You could kind of revamp it. So it seems like there's some challenges, built in. But I guess I'm curious, in that light, are we seeing a trend among these companies to like retrofit existing platforms to kind of make room for things like this, or even creating new installations and builds that are kind of pointing in this direction?
Because I have them, I'll say that briefly. Like I think I personally, and also like from the strategy of the company, made the choice of like, we're just going to work on this new stuff, period. And so then that brings up the question of like, where can you do that work? Mm-hmm. And so it is true that like industries where they are not yet fully calcified, like different types of alternative energy, or like these places where they're doing things very explicitly in a new way, they don't have the legacy to deal with. So like, okay, that's smaller or that's nichey, but like that's also where there's an opportunity to do new work, where you're not having to go back and be like, take on 100 years of legacy. So like choosing where we're working as like where we would start off, I think that's like a client selection or like project selection. That's a big deal for us. It's like, as I've said in other contexts with our business, like in a very big way, like I'm getting out of the business of convincing people that like this is a better way to do this. It's like everybody here, we already know and agree with this. Like whoever's agrees with us, that's who we're going to work with. Like we don't necessarily need to evangelize for now, or that maybe as a survival technique, we're not going to be able to flip people over. If like, yeah, you want to come in, like we'll show you how to do this, but I'm not going to spend all my time arguing with people who don't want it, So anyway, go ahead.
So before I like came over and worked in big tech, I worked for a bunch of small automation houses, and one started off as a candy company before becoming a specialty saw producer. And I got a call, and it was to service a very low serial saw that was like 3 digits. And so I was like, great, send me the nameplate of the machine. And I saw the installation date. It was like 1967, right? And I jokingly like sent an internal email that was like, we have a policy that's, you know, no support for things older than the moon landing, right? But like the point being, like, you know, I don't know who here like works on cars or has like read old relay logic manuals, but like, man, I'm pretty decent when it comes to that stuff, and still found the drawings for this machine. It was like they were written in, you know, like something that needed a Rosetta Stone, right? Like I was like, these words appear to be in English. I do not understand what I'm looking at, right? And so I think supportability is a really interesting concern and story that like needs to be developed from like a DevOps approach as we move into open source. Because ultimately, like for that machine operator, you know, upgrading all of the I/O on their machine was cheaper than having me understand how relay logic worked, even though I, you know, technically should know based on some course that I took, you know? Right. But like that piece of the story, like how do you design so that there can be opportunities for a machine that, you know, came up under Windows 10 or Windows 7 or Windows XP, like what if it's still useful to the owner, you know, beyond when I've retired? Like, does that make it bad? And like, I don't think so. So there are a lot of like life cycle of machine components that we need to think through, which is like, what if there's a bulletproof machine that you know, is just still trucking along 100 years from now? Like, how do we thoughtfully enable a future where it's allowed to exist without like patching a version of React several hundred times?
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, the classical discussion between a ladder and structured text. So at this moment, it makes no sense to try to convince the people who like to do ladder. You need to, for example, if you're an engineer and you want to do this kind of work, don't go to a system integrator or an end user that uses ladder. You find a company that has the mindset. So if you live nearby here, you would go to Loop. You would work for David. If you have your own company, it's going to be very difficult to find customers who are using a ladder to convince them the other way. So you find customers who already have an idea to do it in a different way. And then for the end users, if you are an engineering leader or something, and you want to start changing, you need to find the suppliers who can help you. So you don't try to change everything at the start. You try to find the small pockets where you can do things. Another thing is, so that's a discussion I had this week on LinkedIn, for example. So so I try to bring like DevOps ideas to automation. And then somebody said, yeah, why don't you use the classical DevOps tools? And so my answer was, let's not start to totally change the mindset of people. We have a whole ecosystem. People do things in a certain way, sometimes with a good reason, sometimes not. But also sometimes when you try to introduce something, don't change everything at the same time. You don't try to change all the workflows. You don't try to change the whole ecosystem. You try to change things that make sense. You need to find a way to make it work. You have to get your project sold. So you don't try to fight too hard for things. Try to find opportunities to bring these ideas to companies.
I'm curious about. So we talked a lot about this it's a changing landscape. The threshold is shifting. We're having to bring this technology into new spaces as well as deal with entrenched spaces where they're still doing ladder logic or even more ancient pre-moon landing controls. But now we're here. Like, here's a room full of people who are all interested in this thing that only a very few people were kind of tightly holding for a long time. And I just want to talk a little bit about where we see the opportunity of a group like this. You know, where do we see SASE helping or influencing? How do we see this start to create an impact in the industry in the adoption of this approach?
One of the biggest things that is preventing adoption of open source, we'll say even open source libraries. We're not even going to talk about like runtimes and fully baked things, just open source libraries, is I will see somebody has done some work. They have a GitHub repo. I get excited and I look, and it's 2 contributors, and the last contribution was 5 years ago. And then you look at the thing, and you can see just like this spike of excitement for 6 months, and then it's just dead. And so, yeah, there's probably a very, very, very small number of consequential open source projects and libraries out there that have 2 or 3 contributors, but the ones that have sustaining power and that are trusted is, yes, there may be 2 or 3 cores, but it's a community of people. And partly, you know, like, so Davy and I both, you know, various forms of founder, consultant, whatever. My ability to contribute and put energy into something is like a roller coaster. Like it's even happened internally. We were talking about, you know, doing something where we write logic in one thing and then we transpile it, blah, blah, blah. We were all excited for what, a couple months, and then we all had to like make money and work. And so for me, one of the most important things that might come out of this is to see if there's a way we can prove that, you know, this community, and I'll say the community at large, can actually go find something to work on, even if it's small, and build a community that keeps running. Like, even if it's not the same people, but there's a steady energy input into it. So it's continuous contribution, because like I said, that's the killer. And again, if you go look at any library, even you look and you say the last contributions 5 years ago, you're like, I'm not going to use this. So that's the biggest thing I think the community can do, is find something and with the collective have continuous input into it.
I think that's exactly right. I think that the, you know, I think there's like, when you discover open source and you discover software tools as someone that is a controls engineer, you're like, yes, time for the revolution. And it's like, the revolution looks like 1% better each week. And, you know, 5 years from now, that'll be 300% better. Like we, whether it's a state machine that we would actually all use, and maybe you can't use it on a commercial project, right? Like, but, you know, I'd happily build like some home automation for like rotating the carboy for you know, some home brewing, right? Like there's certainly something here that the only way to actually develop a couple libraries and make them useful is going to be to use them and work on them. And I suspect it's going to start in a middle layer, and then we're going to practice building extensible blocks that, you know, well, how do you connect this generic remote I/O to something that shows the standard progression of a state machine, right? And like that feature request, that will need some design, that will need some thought. And to put the design, thought, and attention into it, we got to do something useful, right? So like that process, you know, it's going to look like a lot of whiteboarding and, you know, debugging and boring work. But the result could be something that is available for commercial use, that is open source, that maybe other people start intentionally contributing to. And I think that's the sign of health that we would aim for as a group here, or one of the signs of health.
Thinking about the role of SASE like in the broader industry brings up for me the question of like, well, why does SASE exist at all? Because we could have just gone and said like, well, let's go to A3 or let's go to, you know, ISA, or like, let's go be a part of this. imagining any of those possibilities, we or any one of us is in that room sort of arguing against the 98% who's like, we don't see this as important. So like, I think what as a baseline for SASE, within this group, within this room, the idea that automation software engineering is very important and is something that we think is going to like revolutionize our industry is already a settled question. Like that's not something that we have to debate among each other, right? And that frees us up a lot of energy to be like, well, at least here, like we can talk about what do we want to do next, not should we exist or is this a thing, And like that is like not only, I think from there we can talk about, should we make Git tutorials? Should we build something? Should we make a committee? That's what I'm excited about. Is like we've already decided that we don't have to have that argument for our existence. Whereas, we'll have to have that argument externally, but within this group, we're on this Slack. We're not having to be like defend that this is like something that makes sense. We already agree on that. That's the definition of who's here, right? And so I think it's like what could we do with that piece? It's like that's the baseline.
So we can build things, and of course it was also my idea for the open process library, which I think it will be important. But for SASE, I think the most important thing is to have the group of people and to keep talking about it. So people are aware that it exists. And people are aware that they can talk to people and say, hey, I want to do this, or because if you would today, you would put a question on the Slack, there's such a wide range. It's not a big group, but it's such a wide range of backgrounds. So we cover discrete industry, process industry, robots. There's automation, MES. We cover the regions. We cover Europe. There's many people who are not here because it's too big flight. So we cover North America, China, Asia. So we have contacts and knowledge everywhere. So if today already somebody would have a question, there's a big chance we would have an answer, or we could bring people in touch where they need to get started. So the basic thing is we need to make sure that it keeps existing. LinkedIn is a very powerful social network. Keep posting on it. Slowly keep pulling people in. It didn't exist before. I was on other discussion forums. I was in one famous Discord, but people didn't want to talk about automation, or they didn't think it was so important. And then David started it, and then suddenly it makes a lot of sense. So that's the basic thing that we need to keep doing, is just talk about it, bring people together. And then building things together, yes, we can do it, and I will probably still keep pushing for this idea, but that's not the basic part. If this would fail, it would not mean that SASE fails. The most important thing is keep bringing people together, talk about what we are doing, talk about what other companies are doing. That's what I think.
I think you're totally nailing it. It's a group of people just come together to talk about, share that, and just exist. But unlike a project, and if you look around here, you'll find a lot of things that I got excited about for 3 weeks and then like are half built and like abandoned. So like I don't think that I have no expectation that we will solve that. But what I do see is like when I went to look on our publishing platform, like without doing like membership drive or any kind of big push, like subscribership grew 10% in the last 90 days. Like just by like whatever natural means it's currently on as a trajectory. Like I've never made something that just started doing that, right? And I'm not even doing it now. It's just like, and so like I think that tells us there's something there. It's more than just like a flash in the pan. There's going to be stuff we come up with and get excited about for a little while, and maybe we'll pick it up later. But like as a group of people, it's continuing to get big. It's just monotonically going up slowly, like, and so I think it's like, how do we make that a little steeper? What do we do to bring others involved? Like we're here as a group of people that are like, have that in common. And yeah, just it feels like it's sort of taking on a life of its own. So that's what I think I'm excited about too.
Well, this has been excellent. I think we're pretty much right on time. I have to look at what comes next. What we're going to be doing next is setting an agenda. So thank you to the panel members for contributing. Thank you for your wonderful questions. We're going to come back in 10 minutes, and then we're going to start doing our agenda setting.